This lesson is on Indochina, and this is part 6 of a 6-part series on East Asia in the post-classical period. Now first I want to look at some southern connections between the early peoples of Vietnam and some of their neighboring people. Right, there was intermarriage between the Khmer and Tai people to the south and east, and this whole cluster of people, right, the ancestors of the modern Vietnamese, as well as Cambodians, Laotians, and Thais, are from a different language family from the Chinese. There's a different migration pattern into the region stretching back to prehistory. And even through the classical period, the southern border of the Viet region was the borderline between Indian and Chinese spheres of influence. So as you know from an earlier lesson in this course, you know, Indochina is kind of half China and half India. That's why we call it that. But this lesson is really going to focus on Vietnam, or the Viet people. Right, so one of the things that characterizes Vietnamese society and culture is that everything's very local. Local control, autonomous villages that are separate and independent largely of any kind of central government. It was also characterized by smaller nuclear families, meaning a mother and a father and children, as opposed to the more extended families that are a part of Chinese culture that would include grandmas and grandpas and aunts and uncles and a much bigger family. Vietnamese families at this time period tended to be smaller. It was less patriarchal than China. Indeed, Vietnamese women were very powerful in markets and trades, and some of the primary sources that we have from the early period where Europe starts coming into contact with people like the Vietnamese. The Europeans were surprised that Vietnamese women were so tough and kind of pushy in business and didn't really bow down to men. And the Vietnamese adopted Buddhism more organically and at the local level, kind of naturally and through conversions. Buddhism was not a state religion in Vietnam in the same way it had been in India and China and even Japan and Korea for a time. And so really when we're looking at Vietnam, we're looking at a sort of selective Sinification. Remember, the root word Sino means Chinese, right? So, you know, the kind of Sinification of adopting Chinese culture and STEM technologies and things like that. The Vietnamese were much more selective. And their relationship with China was always kind of borderline. The peoples of early Vietnam first show up in recorded history as the Nam Viet people, which is just Chinese for the southern people or the people of the south. In the Qin dynasty, which was the dynasty right before the Han dynasty, you know, Shi Huangdi's people, they raided the kingdom of Viet in the 220s BCE, but they were never able to really conquer them. And so this selective Sinification resulted in very profitable trade between Viet and China, right? And things like woods and silks and shells and spices and pearls and feathers, very valuable things to the Chinese, but also very valuable things that the Chinese put out onto the Silk Roads. You know, and the Viet defeated Qin feudal lords in the middle 200s BC or CE and established an independent kingdom. So, you know, they were always kind of, yeah, we'll take what we like from you, China, but then, you know, in other ways we're going to ignore you, we're going to go our own ways. And Vietnam was almost never really pushed around by China in the same way that, for example, Korea was. And in 111 BCE, the Han dynasty, the Han emperor, decided to conquer Viet, and they did this by co-opting local lords and convincing them to adopt Chinese ways. So when we talk about co-opt, that's kind of like, you know, get people onto your side. It's kind of like, you know, persuading them and making deals with them and things like that. And part of the ways they did that was to get the Vietnamese to adopt these Chinese ways, for example, development of schools, or the introduction of Confucianism, or the transfer of agricultural skills and technology. You know, the Han thought they could really influence feudal lords in Vietnam to bring Vietnam into the Chinese way and eventually kind of absorb Vietnam. And as I've said, that just really didn't work. However, you know, the Vietnamese did adopt the bureaucracy of China, mainly so that they could have a more organized government and military, because they wanted to use that against people to the south. So with these Chinese military strategy.
Silver Academy students, it's now time for you to go to the Great Hall to pick up your yearbook if you purchased one and if you have a photo ID. Thank you.
So with the advantage of Chinese military strategy, the Viet were able to push southwards and take over a lot of the Khmer and Tai people to the south and the west. So I'm talking about, pushing down into these areas and expanding and really taking the edge of the peninsula here. But over time, there's starting to be resistance from the Viet, and part of this was because of Chinese attitudes. I mean, the Chinese literally saw everyone else in the world as barbarians. Europeans, Africans, Indians, didn't matter. They saw everybody who wasn't Chinese as a barbarian. And so, of course, this included the Viet people. And the Viet had a strong tradition of being very proud and tough, and they really just didn't want to put up with this. And the Viet lords, grew angry at these Chinese attitudes and treatment. And in 39 CE, the Trung sisters led a successful rebellion against the Han dynasty and started to push the Han back northwards. Part of this was because of Confucian patriarchal values. As I've told you before, the Viet women were very tough and didn't bow down to the men. And so they had a real problem with these Confucian values. Also, Confucianism supported polygamy, and this was very odious to the Vietnamese nuclear family, because of course the nuclear family is just a mother and a father, not a father and 6 mothers. And that was a threat to women's power. We see in some of the primary source documents of the time poetry by Vietnamese women complaining that they have to share their husbands and share their husbands' beds with other women. They just weren't going to put up with that. And so it's kind of an amazing rebellion here, but totally understandable that the Trung sisters led this campaign against China and these Confucian values. And so this was, just the toughness, especially of the women, was one factor that led to Vietnamese independence. They had some other things going for them too, like geography and terrain. Vietnam is a very rocky coastal country with very dense forests. It can be very wet and swampy and humid in places, which, gives rise to diseases like malaria. The climate is very hot and wet, and the Chinese just weren't used to dealing with that. I mean, a lot of the factors that made it difficult for the United States Army in Vietnam were things that were problems for the Chinese, clear back in the classical and post-classical period. And as I've said before, the Sinification in Vietnam was very weak, and the trade links were weak as well. So it was easier for Vietnam to separate from China and push their armies northward than it was for example, the Koreans that were in a place that was much easier for China to fight and dominate. So the Vietnamese got independence from the Chinese in 939 CE, and this was after the fall of the Tang dynasty in 907. As you recall from earlier lessons, the Tang were very expansionist and wanted to control and colonize everyone. And so, after they fell, Vietnam was able to get this independence. And Vietnam maintained their independence until French colonization in the 1800s. So, much more along the lines of Japan than Korea, which was, kind of under Chinese sway all along. And the first dynasty after independence came in 980 CE with the Lý dynasty. And this was, the first independent dynasty that Vietnam had in almost 1,000 years. However, the Lý continued to build Chinese-style palaces. They continued to use a Chinese-style bureaucracy and civil service exams. So, they were all too happy to adopt, the advantages of the Chinese way of life. They just weren't going to, be absorbed and controlled by them. A few other differences that came with independence as well. In Vietnam, the scholar gentry were much more aligned with local villages rather than being under the control of the Emperor of Vietnam. This is that local autonomy that I talked about at the beginning of this lesson. There's also closer links between powerful Buddhist monks and the local peasants. Again, that local autonomy was important in Vietnamese culture and religion as well. And that's also part of what helped Vietnam against the French and the Americans. This tiny coastal country without a lot of resources was able to face off against two of the strongest European, or in Americans' case, the descendants of the Europeans, two of the strongest European colonial forces that there were in the 19th and 20th centuries. And the Vietnamese continued to expand southwards. They took over the Cham people as well as the Khmer. And as I've said before, they were helped by the Chinese military strategy, and this gave them a big advantage against the Indian-style armies of the South in terms of organization and strategy. But as Vietnam stretched southwards and controlled further south along the coast of the peninsula, geography again divided a northern population from a southern one. As I've said, the terrain and climate in Vietnam is very difficult, and so it makes it hard to control large chunks of territory, even when it's an indigenous local control. It's just everything's too spread out and too remote. And so what we could maybe call the Vietnamese Empire split into a northern kingdom ruled by the Trinh dynasty and a southern kingdom ruled by the Nguyen dynasty. And again, that would remain that way until the French invaded, with the purpose of bringing Catholicism to Vietnam. And so some final thoughts here, right? The last three lessons have shown you two models of how the core and periphery model usually works out, right? In the case of Japan and Vietnam, there's selective adoption of the core state's culture, STEM, political values with varying levels of independence, but the key there is the independence and the selective adoption of culture while remaining, somewhat independent and, usually very fiercely militaristic and strong. Korea, of course, the opposite, complete adoption of the core state's culture and STEM and political values, and the elite's alignment with the core state to turn the periphery state into a place for the core to exploit natural resources extraction. So, I want you to think about this because it's going to help you in your understanding of, how European colonization in the 17th through the 20th centuries worked out, and where some of the developing nations of the world are right now in terms of, coming out of being periphery states and becoming really independent actors on their own. That's a big feature in 20th century history, which you'll be getting to later. So that's it. Thanks for watching.